I dressed carefully that morning. I don't know why that detail stays with me, but it does. I wore a gray blouse I'd bought for my daughter's school concert and hadn't worn since. I pressed it the night before. I remember standing at the ironing board at 11 o'clock at night thinking, this matters. Dress like it matters. I drove 2 hours. I rearranged 3 days of my life to be in that room. School pickups shuffled to a neighbor. A work call rescheduled. My son's dentist appointment pushed to the following week. I did all of it without being asked, because that's what you do when your mother dies and leaves things behind that need to be settled. You show up. You have always shown up. That was, as far as I understood it, the entire point of me. The lawyer's office was on the second floor of a building that smelled like carpet cleaner and old paper. 5 people were already seated when I arrived. Dean, my brother, 47, in a suit that fit too well for a Tuesday. His wife Sandra beside him, hands in her lap, her face arranged into the expression she reserves for situations she has already processed and put away. 2 people I didn't recognize near the window. A man and a woman, quiet, professionally still in the way that said legal staff. And then there was the woman seated closest to the lawyer's desk. She was maybe 39, maybe 40. Dark hair pulled back without fuss, a plain navy jacket. She was sitting the way my mother used to sit, very straight, very contained, hands folded in her lap with her fingers interlaced in exactly the same way. The same way. I noticed it, and then I looked away from it, because noticing it felt like a thing I didn't have the right context for yet. I sat down. I said hello to Dean. He said hello back. He did not look at me when he said it. He looked at the edge of the table. The lawyer started reading. He was a thorough man, methodical. He read the way someone reads when they're not expecting interruptions. Steadily, without pauses, like the text was a river he'd already mapped. I listened. I listened for my name. The house went to Dean. A savings account, split between Dean and an entity I'd never heard of. A trust, established, and here he read a date. Established in 1987, amended and redirected in 2019. The trust was now controlled by a named beneficiary. He said the name. It was not my name. I looked at Dean. He was looking at the table. Still. The lawyer kept reading. Other accounts, a vehicle, some personal property. He moved through all of it with the same steady river voice. And my name was not in any of it. Not once. Not in a footnote. Not in a minor bequest. Not in the kind of small sentimental gesture you make when you're leaving someone something just to say you thought of them. Nothing. My hands were flat on the arms of the chair. I could feel the wood grain through my palms. I said quietly, I think there's been a mistake. The lawyer stopped. My name isn't. I'm not on this document. He looked at me. He had a careful face. The kind of face that has delivered this kind of information before and has learned to hold itself very still while doing it. He said, this is the current and final version of the estate documents, filed and witnessed in March of this year. I said, March. My mother died in April. She called me 3 weeks before she died. A Sunday, we always talked on Sundays, and she was tired but clear, and at the end of the call she said, everything I built for you. You know that. I wrote it down in my planner because I wanted to remember it. Because she wasn't always a person who said things like that directly, and when she did, it felt like something you should keep. I said, I know, Mom. And then she died. And then I pressed my gray blouse. And then I drove 2 hours. And now I was sitting in a room where my name did not exist. I turned to look at the woman by the desk. I don't know what I expected. Discomfort, maybe. Embarrassment. The natural human response to being handed something in front of the person it was taken from. She looked back at me. And the thing that moved through me when she did, It settled in my chest like a stone dropped in still water, heavy and slow, because her expression was not surprise. It was not guilt. It was not the face of someone who felt they were witnessing something unfair. It was recognition. It was the look of someone who had been waiting for this room, specifically, for a very long time, waiting for me to walk into it, waiting to see my face when I understood. I did not cry. I want to say that because it matters. I didn't make a sound. I picked up my bag, I stood up, and I walked out of the office and down the stairs and through the door of the building, and I stood on the sidewalk in my pressed gray blouse while the morning traffic moved past me like none of it was happening. The trust was established in 1987. I was born in 1983. Someone began planning this before I could read, before I could ask questions, before I had any way of knowing there were questions to ask. I didn't know yet what that meant, but I knew it meant something. I knew my mother had called me the week before she died and said what she said, and I knew that whatever she meant by it, she did not mean the house, she did not mean the money, she did not mean a single thing that was in that room. What I didn't know was what she did mean, and why. For the first time standing on that sidewalk, I couldn't be sure she was the one who'd been managing me, or whether something had been done to her too. My mother was not a warm woman in the way people usually mean when they say that. She didn't hug first. She didn't call just to hear your voice. She was not the kind of mother who sat on the edge of your bed when you were sad and rubbed your back and asked gentle questions. That was not her language, and she didn't apologize for it. Her language was precision. She remembered things. She remembered that I take my coffee with a small amount of milk and no sugar, and she remembered that it switched from a lot of milk when I was in my 20s, and she made the adjustment without comment. She remembered the name of the girl who was unkind to me in the 4th grade. 30 years later, she remembered that girl's first name and the name of her mother and the approximate street they'd lived on. She filed things. She held things. That was how she showed you she'd been paying attention. When I was growing up, Dean was already on his way out. He's 6 years older than me. By the time I was 11, he was at college, and after college there was a job in another city, and after that there was Sandra, and after Sandra there was a life that was separate and sealed and complete. He came back at Christmas. He spoke about his work in polished sentences and ate my mother's food, and then he went back. That was Dean. I stayed. Not because anyone asked me to. I stayed because it felt like the natural thing, the obvious thing, the thing that made sense for who I was. Or who I believed I was. I went to a university 40 minutes from home. I married someone local. I had my daughter and then my son, and I made a life close enough that my mother could be in it regularly, not just seasonally. We talked every Sunday. That was a rhythm we'd fallen into so long ago I can't name when it started. Sunday afternoon, after lunch, Eleanor would call, or I would call, and we'd talk for 40 minutes or an hour about nothing important and everything that mattered. My daughter's school, my mother's garden, the neighbor's dog. Sometimes an old memory she'd surface without preamble, a trip we'd taken when I was 7, a teacher she'd liked, a recipe she'd made once and never repeated. She didn't explain why she thought of it. She just offered it, like she was handing me a piece of something she'd been holding. My daughter is named Clara, after my mother's mother. My son's middle name is Halcott, the name of a small farm in a county 2 hours north that Eleanor grew up on and never fully left, even after she left it. I have been there twice, both times with Eleanor. Both times in autumn when the fields had gone yellow and the air had that particular cold apple smell that you don't get in the city. On the second trip, we went through the old house. It was still in the family in some technical sense, managed through some arrangement I never asked enough about. Eleanor moved through the rooms like she was remembering each one separately. She opened a closet off the back bedroom. There was a cedar box on the upper shelf, The kind with brass hinges small enough to carry with one hand. She looked at it for a moment. She said, "That's where I keep the important things." I said, "Like what?" She said, "The things that last." And then she closed the closet and we went back to the kitchen and made tea. I assumed she meant photographs, letters, the kind of sentimental record a private person keeps in a physical container because they don't trust it to the world. I didn't push. I didn't ask to look inside. I told myself there would be time for that later. I have thought about that cedar box every day since I walked out of the lawyer's office. Eleanor used to end our calls and our visits with a particular phrase. Not every time, but often enough that I noticed it. Often enough that I held it. When I'd be heading to the door or when we'd said everything else, she'd say, "You're the one who stayed." I took that to mean love. I took that to mean recognition, that she saw the choice I'd made, the proximity, the Sundays, the waiting rooms. I built something around those words, a small load-bearing structure of meaning that I leaned on more than I knew. Dean left. Dean received everything. I stayed. I received nothing. I didn't understand that yet. Standing on the sidewalk outside the lawyer's office, the arithmetic of it hadn't assembled itself yet. But looking back, I can see it. The whole structure of my belief about that family, and the way it was already beginning to fail at the joints. There was a moment. Not a dramatic one. About 3 years before Eleanor died during a Sunday call in late October, I mentioned that I'd been thinking about the farm. I said I'd love to take the kids up sometime. Eleanor said, "We'll plan it." And then, after a small pause, she said something I didn't catch quite right. The call had some noise on her end. "I thought," she said, "there are things up there I want to show you." I said, "What kind of things?" She said, "Nothing that needs to be rushed." I let it go. That was something I did with Eleanor. Let the things she didn't fully open move past without forcing them. Because she always came back. She always came back to what she needed to say, eventually, in her own time, in her own way. Except that this time, she didn't. She died before we ever made the trip. And the cedar box, the one with the brass hinges, holding the things that last, I don't know where it is now. It wasn't on any list in that lawyer's office. It wasn't mentioned. It wasn't left to anyone, as far as I was told. But Dean didn't look up from that table once during the entire reading. Not when the lawyer said his name. Not when the lawyer said Caroline's name. Not when I stood up and said there'd been a mistake. He already knew there hadn't been. 18 months before the lawyer's office. A Sunday in October, warm enough still that Eleanor had the kitchen window open. She'd asked me to come help with her medical paperwork. The kind of thing that had been piling up on her counter in that particular way of hers, in a system that made complete sense to her and no sense to anyone else. Insurance forms, prior authorization requests, a letter from a specialist's billing department that needed a response. We sat at the kitchen table. She made coffee. I started sorting. Most of it was what she said it was. Medical forms, duplicates, things that could be recycled and things that needed to be filed. I made 2 piles and worked through them steadily while Eleanor read the mail and occasionally handed me something to deal with. Then I came across a form that didn't belong with the rest. It wasn't a medical form. It was a single page, printed, already filled out. A beneficiary designation form. I could see the name of a credit union at the top. Not a bank I recognized, not one Eleanor had ever mentioned. The account number was partially visible. The date the account was opened, 2004. In the beneficiary field, a name. 2 words, handwritten in ink, Caroline Parrish. I looked at it. I set it in neither pile. I placed it to the side by itself. I meant to ask. I was formulating the question, something calm, casual, something that didn't announce the small alarm going off behind my sternum. When Eleanor came back into the kitchen, she looked at the table. Her eyes moved across the piles. They stopped. She picked up the form. She folded it once, lengthwise, without looking at me, and she put it in the pocket of her cardigan. The whole thing took maybe 4 seconds. Smooth. Practiced. The movement of someone who had thought about this specific moment and had decided in advance how they would handle it. Then she said, brightly, "Should we order soup? I've been craving that place on Elm." And I said, "Sure." And that was it. The conversation moved on the way conversations move on when you aren't yet ready to be the one who makes it stop. But I kept the name. I didn't write it down. I didn't need to. Some names arrive differently, with a weight that isn't proportional to how many letters they have. Caroline Parrish. I turned it over on the drive home. I turned it over while I made dinner. I turned it over in the shower that night. And by 10 o'clock, I was sitting on the edge of my bed with my phone open. I searched for it. Caroline Parrish. There wasn't much. A Facebook profile with no photo, no posts visible, just a name attached to an account that appeared dormant. An address that came up in a property record for a town about 2 hours from my mother's house. Nothing else that was clearly the same person. I told myself it could be anyone, an old friend, a colleague, a distant relative on a branch of the family I'd never had reason to trace. The account was opened in 2004. That was specific enough to make me uncomfortable, but not specific enough to mean anything on its own. People have accounts. People name beneficiaries. It doesn't have to mean what the cold feeling in my chest was trying to insist it meant. So I filed it, under the category of things I'd noticed but hadn't asked about. That category had more entries than I'd ever acknowledged, but I'd never looked at it straight before. I'd just kept adding to it and telling myself the pile wasn't as large as it was getting. The trust in the lawyer's office was established in 1987. This account was opened in 2004. 2 separate dates. 2 separate things. Except they both lead to the same name, and the same name was sitting 3 feet from the lawyer's desk on the morning my mother's estate was read, and she looked at me with the face of someone who had been expecting me specifically. I keep coming back to Eleanor's hands in that kitchen, the way she folded the form, the way she slid it into her pocket. There was no hesitation, no flushing, no stammering, no over-explanation. She didn't say, "Oh, that's just something from years ago," or "I'll explain that sometime." She said nothing. She said nothing and offered soup, and I let the distance between those 2 things stand, and I went home. I keep asking myself what I would have found if I'd looked inside that cedar box on the farm. I keep asking myself whether Eleanor kept it locked. I want to be honest about what the next few months felt like, because the easy version is that I was suspicious and building toward something. The true version is harder. The true version is that I loved my mother, and loving her meant I was very motivated to find explanations that didn't require her to be someone other than who I believed she was. So I found them. Over and over, I found them. Dean started calling Eleanor more. This was notable enough that it registered. Dean, who had always been the peripheral son, the Christmas presents, the one who sent gifts from a distance rather than showing up in person. Suddenly he was calling on Tuesdays. I only found this out because I called one Tuesday afternoon and Eleanor said, warmly, easily, "Let me call you back. I'm on with Dean." And when she called back 20 minutes later, I didn't ask about it. I told myself it was good. Eleanor's health was declining. Of course Dean was calling more. I told myself that. A woman named Ruth, one of Eleanor's longtime church friends, the kind of woman who fills silence with words that don't quite mean anything, pulled me aside at a fundraiser in November. She squeezed my arm and said, "Your mother is so proud of you, you know, for everything you've been to her. Have been." That was the tense she used. I stood there for a moment after she walked away. Past tense. Not are. Not mean to her, but have been. as if the thing were already finished, as if she were summing up. I told myself I was reading too much into the grammar of a woman making small talk at a church fundraiser. I tried with Eleanor. Not directly. I didn't yet have the nerve or the specific suspicion for direct. I mentioned casually that my daughter was making a memory box for a school project, and that it had me thinking about family history. I said I'd love to go through old photos together, old letters, whatever Eleanor had kept from the early years. Eleanor said, "Of course, sweetheart." Easy, warm, immediate. And then it never happened. There was always something else. An appointment, a tired week, a better time that was always just a little further off. I let that slide 3 or 4 times before I stopped suggesting it. Then came January. I drove up on a Friday afternoon. Eleanor was having a reasonable stretch. She had good days and bad days by then, and this was a good run. She'd made tea. She was sitting in the living room with a book open in her lap, which meant she was comfortable. We talked. We had the ordinary, irreplaceable conversation of two people who have known each other for 40 years and don't need to perform it anymore. After an hour or so, she needed to use the bathroom. I offered to get more tea. I stood up, walked toward the kitchen, and the hallway to Eleanor's study runs off the same corridor. The study door was closed. I registered it because it was never closed. In 20 years of visiting that house, I had walked past that study door, and it had been open. Books visible from the hall, a lamp with a warm shade, the particular smell of old paper and wood polish, always open. It was closed. And through the door, just audible enough that it reached me, was Eleanor's voice. Low, deliberate. The tone she used when she was being careful about something. She said, "She doesn't need to know yet." That was all I caught. I don't know what came before it. I don't know what came after. I stood in the hallway and my hand was on the wall, and the plaster was cold under my palm, and for a moment, nothing in my body moved. I didn't knock. I walked back to the kitchen. I put the kettle on. I stood there looking at the window above the sink, at the winter garden outside, at the bare branches of the apple tree, and I waited. Eleanor came out a few minutes later. Her face was her normal face, warm, precise, controlled, the face I had known and oriented by for my whole life. She said, "You want coffee?" I said, "Sure." I sat at that kitchen table and drank coffee with my mother, and I did not say, "Who are you talking to?" I did not say, "What is it I don't need to know yet?" I didn't say anything. I want to say I was afraid. But it was more specific than fear. It was that I did not yet want to know what I would find if I pulled at that thread, because I still had the thing I had, my mother, alive, in a warm kitchen, making coffee. And I was not ready to trade that for the truth. The word that stayed with me was yet, because yet is not the word you use for something innocent. Yet implies a schedule. It implies that there's a plan, and the plan has stages. And whatever I wasn't supposed to know was going to be revealed at a specific time that someone had already decided on. Someone other than me. I drove home in the dark and I thought about the form on the kitchen table. I thought about the cedar box. I thought about Dean calling on Tuesdays. I thought about Ruth and the past tense. I thought about the study door, closed for the first time in 20 years. And I thought about all the questions I have never asked, and whether that too was part of someone's plan. Eleanor deteriorated quickly once spring started. I don't say that to make the timeline feel clean. I say it because it wasn't clean at all. It was the specific cruelty of a body that fights, and then suddenly doesn't. And you go from having time to having very little time without a clear moment where the shift happened. There were good weeks, and then there weren't. During one of the last good weeks, April, Eleanor home, sitting up, eating, more alert than she'd been in a month. Dean called me. A Wednesday morning. He called my cell and not the house phone, which he almost never did. And he said, "Can you come up? Just you, not the kids." I asked if everything was all right with Mom. He said, "She wants to talk to both of us. Come this afternoon if you can." I rearranged my afternoon. I drove up. Dean's car was already in the driveway. I let myself in with my key. They were in the living room, Eleanor in her chair, the good one near the window, Dean on the sofa with his elbows on his knees. The room had a stillness to it that wasn't quite ordinary stillness. It was the stillness of people who have been waiting. I sat down. I looked at my mother. She looked back at me for a moment without speaking, the way she sometimes did when she was deciding how to begin. Then she said, "I need to tell you something I should have told you a long time ago." She had a relationship, she said, before she met our father. A young man. She was 21. It was 1982. She used the phrase "a different time" more than once, which I understood was doing some load-bearing work in the explanation. She became pregnant. She was alone. She was not yet the woman she would become. She said that too. And I heard in it something that was both true and convenient, the way certain truths can also be convenient. She made an arrangement, not an agency, a private family arrangement, through intermediaries, people who knew people. The child was placed. She thought about the child for every year of her life after. In 2004, she found her. Or they found each other. The telling was a little unclear on the direction of it, and I noticed that, but I didn't press. They had been corresponding, a quiet correspondence, letters, sometimes calls. The woman's name was Caroline. Eleanor looked at me. She said, "I didn't tell you because I didn't know how. I was ashamed. I was afraid of exactly the look on your face right now." I put my hand over my mouth. I didn't cry yet, but I was going to. She said, "She is not my family the way you are. You are my family. You're the one who stayed." There it was again. That phrase. That exact phrase. And this time it landed like a hand placed gently on a wound, not solving anything but acknowledging it. I felt the pressure of it in my throat. I cried. Not dramatically. I sat in that chair with my shoulders tight and my eyes full, and I nodded, and eventually I reached across and held my mother's hand, and she squeezed my fingers with the precise, specific grip she'd always had. Dean sat very still on the sofa. He didn't say much. He nodded a few times when Eleanor spoke. He accepted a cup of tea Sandra had made and didn't drink it. I told myself his stillness was discomfort. The discomfort of a man who has always found emotion a foreign country. I drove home that evening believing I understood. I understood. Eleanor had a daughter before us. A private wound, a private correspondence. A woman named Caroline she had loved from a cautious distance for 20 years. The credit union account made sense now. Opened in 2004, the year of contact. A financial gesture toward a daughter she couldn't claim publicly. Painful, yes. Complicated, yes. But human. Comprehensible. Fitting, actually, with the Eleanor I knew. Private, controlled, operating always on her own timeline and no one else's. I rebuilt my love for her around this new shape. It held. I stayed. I kept showing up. I drove her to appointments and sat in the waiting rooms with my phone face down in my lap and my hands available if she needed them. I held her hand in the hospital. I was there, as I had always been, as I had built my entire adult proximity around being. She called me from the hospital on the Sunday before she died. Her voice was tired. She said, "Everything I built for you. You know that." I said, "I know, Mom." And I did know. I knew it completely. I had the explanation. I had the story. I had the whole architecture of it neatly assembled. The trust was established in 1987. Caroline was born in 1982. A trust for a daughter's benefit, set up 5 years after her birth. That made sense. It was almost the most plausible part of the whole story, but Eleanor would have been 25 in 1987. She married our father in 1985. She had Dean in 1977. Before the relationship, before Caroline, before all of it. By 1987, she was a married woman with a 10-year-old son and a 4-year-old daughter, living a life she had built very deliberately after the private wound of 1982. And she established a trust then, in 1987, for a daughter she was supposedly never going to acknowledge. I didn't see it yet. I was too close to the love, too relieved by the explanation, too grateful for the version that let me keep my mother intact. But the date sat in the back of my mind like something left on the stove, quiet and warm, with nothing in the pot. She died on a Thursday. I was there. I had been there for the last 3 days without going home. My husband had the kids. I slept in the chair by her bed in the way that isn't really sleep. Shallow, alert, woken by every change in her breathing. And then early on Thursday morning, her breathing changed in a way it didn't change back from, and by 7:15, it was over. I held her hand for a long time after. Dean arrived at 9. He stood in the doorway and looked at her, and then he looked at me, and he said, "You were here." Not a question. I said yes. He nodded and came in. We did the things you do. We called the right people. We made the right calls. Dean handled most of the administrative side. He's always been better at that, at the procedural management of things. I packed her personal items from the room. I took her cardigan off the chair by the window. I put it in my bag because I couldn't stand the thought of it going into a plastic bag with the rest of the hospital property. There was nothing in the pockets. I noticed that. I told myself it meant nothing. She'd been in the hospital for 2 weeks by then. Of course, her pockets were empty. I went home and I grieved the way grief actually moves. Not in a clean wave, but in unexpected corners. My daughter would say something ordinary at dinner and I'd have to leave the room. I'd pick up my phone to call her on a Sunday before remembering. I'd start to form a sentence in my head and realize it was addressed to someone who wasn't there to receive it. I told myself I was finished with the questions. I had the story. The story explained Caroline, explained the account, explained the secrecy. Eleanor had made her peace with it, in her own contained way, and she'd told us before she died, and that was what mattered. I was going to let the questions go. 3 weeks later, she called me. 3 weeks after Eleanor died, Caroline Parrish called my mobile phone. I don't know how she had my number. I didn't ask immediately. I was so startled by the call itself that I just answered and stood in my kitchen with a dish in my hand and said, "Hello?" She said, "Is this Mara?" I said yes. She said, "I think we should meet. I know this is strange, but there are things about your mother I think you should know, and I'd rather tell you in person than have you find out another way." I put the dish down on the counter. My hand was still when I let go of it, and then it wasn't. I said, "How did you get this number?" She paused. Then she said, "Dean gave it to me." Dean. Not Eleanor. Dean. I stood in my kitchen for what felt like a long time. She waited on the other end without filling the silence, which told me something about her. She was patient. She was deliberate. She had probably prepared for this call. She wasn't nervous. Or if she was managing it precisely. The way Eleanor managed things precisely. I said, "When?" She said, "When what?" I said, "When did Dean give you my number?" Another pause. Shorter this time. She said, "About 2 years ago. 2 years ago, Eleanor was alive. 2 years ago, I was calling every Sunday and driving up for appointments and sitting in waiting rooms. 2 years ago, I was the daughter who stayed. The one Eleanor said everything had been built for. the one who was being managed through a closed study door while someone said she doesn't need to know yet. 2 years ago, Dean gave my number to a woman I had never heard of. And not once. In all the Sundays and the drives and the hand-holding and the waiting rooms, did anyone think to tell me? I said, "All right." I said, "Tell me where." We met at a coffee place she chose, a neutral, unremarkable place in a town roughly halfway between us. I arrived first. I picked a table by the window because I wanted to see her walk in. I wanted the few seconds of watching her before she saw me. She came in at exactly the time she'd said. That precision registered. She spotted me immediately. She'd seen me in the lawyer's office, so she knew my face. And she walked over without hesitation and sat down and looked at me directly. And for a moment, neither of us said anything. Up close, the resemblance was even more specific than I'd caught in the lawyer's office. Not a vague family resemblance, not the kind you could attribute to coincidence or the limits of human facial pattern. It was in the jaw, yes, as I'd noticed before, but also in the way she held her mouth when she wasn't speaking, slightly pressed, slightly compressed, the expression of a person who is used to thinking before they speak. Eleanor's expression. I had made that expression myself. I had watched myself make it in mirrors my whole life and attributed it to some learned habit, some absorbed mannerism of a daughter near her mother. I looked across a coffee shop table at this woman's face, and I understood, in my body before I understood it anywhere else, that she was not Eleanor's daughter in the way I had been told. I didn't say that yet. I let her talk. She had been raised by a family in the town 2 hours north, not the town near the farm, but close. She'd had a good enough childhood, she said, with the particular, careful neutrality of someone who has practiced saying this without revealing too much. She'd known from early on that she was not biologically her parents' child. They hadn't hidden it. What they hadn't known, or what they hadn't told her, was anything specific about where she'd come from. She found Eleanor in 2004. She'd done a search, made contact through a service, eventually tracked it back to a woman named Eleanor in a city 2 hours south. Eleanor had responded. They had met, once, in person. And after that meeting, Eleanor had established. Here Caroline paused and looked at her coffee. Eleanor had restructured an existing arrangement to include her more formally. I said, "The trust." She said yes. I said, "It was established in 1987. She said, underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 0, underscore, underscore. I said, "You were born in 1982. She nodded. I said, "Why 1987? If the trust was for you, if it was set up for the child she'd placed, why not set it up in 1982 when she made the arrangement? Or later, when she found you in 2004? Why 1987 specifically?" Caroline looked at me. She turned her coffee cup a quarter turn on the table without picking it up. She said, "Because 1987 was the year your mother found out about me. She didn't place me voluntarily. She didn't know I existed until I was 5 years old. The window beside me had a cold draft coming through the frame. I could feel it on the side of my face. I said, "What do you mean she didn't know?" Caroline said, "Your mother was not my birth mother." She let that sit. Then she said, "Your father was my birth father." The coffee shop was doing its ordinary work around us. Someone at the counter was ordering something. Music played at a low, meaningless volume. A child at a nearby table dropped a spoon and laughed at the sound it made on the floor. I did not move. I said slowly, "Then who is your—" She said, "A woman your father had an affair with, before your parents married. She was very young. She gave me up through a private arrangement. Your father knew. He arranged it. He paid for it." I said, underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 1, underscore, underscore. Found out in 1987. She found a document. A payment record. Eleanor in 1987. Eleanor, who had just had me, her 4-year-old, and had a 10-year-old son and a husband and a life she was holding together with both hands. Eleanor, who found a document and discovered that her husband had a child she'd known nothing about. Eleanor, who then, rather than falling apart, established a trust. I said, why would she set up a trust when she found out? Why would she do anything for you? You weren't her responsibility. You were the proof her husband had, Caroline said quietly, because I was a 5-year-old child who had nothing to do with what the adults in this situation had done, and your mother understood that. Whatever else she was, she understood that. I put both hands around my coffee cup. The ceramic was warm, and I held on to that. I thought about Eleanor's precision, her filing, her remembering. I thought about the way she had looked at me across rooms my whole life with an expression I had always read as love, and recognized now, sitting in this coffee shop, was more complicated than love. It was love and it was guilt, and it was some decision she had made, some massive, ongoing, private decision about what the truth was worth and to whom. She kept Caroline at a distance. She maintained a correspondence. She restructured the trust in 2019 when it became clear she was running out of time. She had Dean as her executor, Dean who had known. I was certain now Dean had known, and she had kept me close, the way you keep someone close when you're managing what they know. You're the one who stayed. I understood it now. The phrase. The phrase she used every time she needed me to feel that my closeness was the reward, that my presence was valued, that staying had been worth it. I had stayed close enough that she could control what I saw. I looked at Caroline across the table. I said, did she tell you what she told me? About being your birth mother? About the correspondence? The arrangement in 1982? Caroline said, no. She said, I think she told you that story so that you would accept the name Caroline Parrish in her paperwork and move on. I sat with that for a long time. Then I said, the cedar box. On the farm. Did you ever? Caroline said. She gave me the contents of it. 2 years before she died. That's why Dean called you afterward to say the farmhouse visit was cancelled. Dean had called me in 2021 to say the farmhouse wasn't available that autumn. A maintenance issue, he'd said. Vague, I hadn't pushed. Of course I hadn't pushed. The cedar box. The important things. The things that last. Eleanor had handed them to the person she'd decided should have them, and she'd arranged a maintenance excuse so her other daughter, the one who stayed, would never think to look on that shelf. I drove home in the dark, the way I had driven home from Eleanor's so many times. The road was the same road. The car was the same car. But I kept both hands on the wheel a little tighter than usual, because the drive felt different when you understood that the whole time you'd been making it toward something, the thing you were driving toward had been quietly, deliberately rerouted. I didn't go back to the lawyer right away. I didn't call Dean. I didn't do anything that felt like action for about 10 days, which I think was my body deciding that the mind needed that much time before it could be trusted to move. I went to work. I made school lunches. I helped my daughter with a project about water cycles that involved a lot of food coloring and a pie tin. I watched my son fall asleep on the sofa with his shoes still on, and I sat for a few minutes just looking at him before I picked him up and carried him to bed. I did the ordinary things. I let the ordinary things be what they were. But at night, I went through everything I had. I had the date, 1987, the age of the trust. I had Caroline's account of it. Her father, not her mother, Eleanor finding a payment record, a private arrangement made before Eleanor was ever part of it. I had the cedar box, now empty, contents gone. I had Eleanor's voice through a closed door. She doesn't need to know yet. I had Dean, who'd had Caroline's contact 2 years before Eleanor died. Dean, who sat in that lawyer's office and did not look up once. Dean, who received everything in a will that would have required multiple revisions, multiple decisions, extended legal preparation, none of which happens without the executor knowing exactly what's coming. Dean knew. Dean had known for a long time. The question I kept landing on was different from the one I'd started with. I'd started by asking why my mother had cut me out. I'd moved to asking what the real story of Caroline was. But now I was asking something simpler and in some ways worse. What was I for? Because I was not kept close out of nothing. Proximity doesn't just happen. I called every Sunday, and Eleanor answered every Sunday. And Eleanor was not a woman who did things by accident or out of inertia. She was not a woman who forgot why she was doing something. If she kept me close, she kept me close for a reason. I think the reason was containment. I think I was kept close enough that I was never far enough away to go looking. I was always about to visit, always about to have the conversation, always about to go through the old photos. And that nearness meant the questions never had room to become action. The love was real. I have to be careful here because I believe the love was real, and I think that is the most complicated part of all of this. It is possible to love someone and also use them. It is possible to keep a person close because you need them where you can see them. Eleanor did both. I was her younger daughter, and I think she loved me genuinely, and I think she also understood that my love for her was the most effective thing she had for keeping the inheritance structure intact. I needed to see the original trust documents, not the summary from the lawyer's reading, the original filing. Trusts are public record once an estate enters probate. I had the right to request them. I found a solicitor through a colleague, a woman who dealt with estate disputes, who I called on a Thursday morning from my car outside the school and explained the situation to in approximately 6 minutes, voice flat, professional, because if I let myself feel it fully while explaining it, I would not get through it. She said, "You need to come in." I went in that Friday. She pulled the trust documents within a week. She called me to say she had them. She said, "There are several things in here I want to walk you through in person." I drove to her office. I sat across from her desk. She had a printed copy in front of her, tabbed at 3 points. She opened to the first tab. She said, "The trust was established in March 1987. The settlor, that is, the person creating the trust, is listed here." She turned the page toward me. The settlor was not Eleanor. The settlor was my father. My father, who died when I was 16, who I had grieved, who I had carried, whose absence had in some ways been the thing that made me stay close to Eleanor, stay close to the parent I had left. He had created the trust in 1987 for a child, for Caroline. Born of a relationship before his marriage, he had created it, had it managed quietly for years, had presumably planned at some point to disclose it or to let it do its work after he was gone. He died in 1999. I was 16. He died of a heart attack with no warning and no last words, and no opportunity to explain anything. Eleanor was the surviving trustee. She had sat with that trust for 23 years. She had maintained it. She had amended it in 2019. This was her amendment, her decision. She had redirected it and formalized Caroline as the primary beneficiary and named Dean as executor. And she had done all of this while continuing to call me every Sunday and tell me I was the one who stayed. My solicitor said, carefully, "You may have grounds to contest. The amendment in 2019 was made by someone who was acting as trustee of your father's instrument, not as sole creator. There are questions about her authority to redirect the principal." I sat there for a moment. Then I said, "What about the rest of it? The house? The savings account? Those were in Eleanor's sole name? She said, yes. Those are not contestable. So Eleanor had made sure the things that were hers were fully hers, placed where I had no legal reach. And the one thing that might have been my father's, the trust, had been handled by a woman who had 23 years to figure out how to place it where I couldn't reach it either. I thought about the form on Eleanor's kitchen table, the beneficiary designation form she folded and put in her cardigan pocket. The account at the credit union, opened in 2004. Two things, the trust and the account, both pointing to Caroline. I thought about Eleanor finding the payment record in 1987 and making a choice. She could have left. She could have contested. She could have exposed what her husband had done before she married him. Instead, she stayed. She stayed and she managed it and she controlled it for the rest of her life. She stayed the way I stayed, with both hands on the wheel, on a road that kept being quietly, deliberately rerouted. The solicitor asked me what I wanted to do. I said, I need to think. I drove home. I picked up my daughter from school. She got in the car and told me about a girl in her class who had said something unkind about her drawing, and I listened, really listened, to every detail of the lunch table geography, the specific words, the specific look. I said, that sounds really unfair. She said, it was. I said, I believe you. She leaned her head against the window and watched the street go past. I thought, I will not do to you what was done to me. I will not manage you. I will not keep you close so that you stay where I can see you. I will not build an architecture of phrases designed to make you feel that your proximity is the reward. I thought, if I find something in those records that says what I think it might say, I'm going to say it out loud. To you. When you're old enough, I'm going to say it directly. I dropped my daughter at home. I called the solicitor back. I said, let's file. The contest took 14 months. Dean did not speak to me for most of that time. Sandra sent one email in the third month, the kind of email that is polite in vocabulary and threatening in structure, and I forwarded it to my solicitor and didn't respond. Caroline, to her credit, did not oppose the contest. She responded through her own solicitor with a statement that said she had no objection to a full review of the original trust instrument and its amendments. I have thought about that statement a lot. I think it took something to write it. My father's trust was partially recovered. A portion of the principal, not all of it, not the amount it would have grown to over 30 years of proper management, but a portion, was determined to have been redirected beyond Eleanor's authority as trustee. That portion came to me. It's not a life-changing sum. It's not nothing. But money was not really what the 14 months were for. I have a box now. A shoebox. Nothing fancy. In it are the documents from the legal contest, tabbed and organized the way Eleanor would have done it. I have a copy of the original trust from 1987, my father's signature at the bottom. I have a copy of Eleanor's amendment. I have the statement from Caroline's solicitor. I have the memory of pressing my gray blouse the night before I drove 2 hours to a room where my name didn't exist. I have my mother's voice saying, "You're the one who stayed." And now I understand all of the things it meant, including the ones she never said to my face. I stayed. That's true. She needed me to. And I did. And the love was real enough that it worked. She knew me well enough to know it would work. You don't keep someone close for 20 years without knowing exactly who they are. And I know who I am. I know what I'm made of. I know I have a daughter who I will not manage, and a son who I will not reroute, and a Sunday afternoon that is mine now. No call to make, no approval to maintain, no careful proximity to perform. I know what the cedar box held. Documents, mostly. A photograph. A letter from my father to Eleanor in 1987, which Caroline shared with me when we met for the second time, in the same coffee shop, at the same table. Her choice again. In the letter, my father explained what he had done. He asked Eleanor to forgive him. He said he had set up the trust so that the child would not be left with nothing, and he said he understood if Eleanor could not accept it, and he said whatever she decided, he would understand. Eleanor apparently decided to stay, and to manage, and to keep the secret in a cedar box on a farm shelf for 34 years. I held the letter in that coffee shop and I read it twice. And Caroline sat across from me and waited, patient, deliberate, with our father's jaw and Eleanor's stillness and a life she had built without any of us in it. And I thought, we are both daughters of a woman who stayed and controlled what everyone around her could see. We are both, in our own way, the ones who stayed. I put the letter down on the table. Caroline said, "She did love you?" I said, "I know." I said, "That's the part I'm still working on."